A few announcements. There will be an RE committee meeting after the service today at 12:30. And Maggie and Pete also have announcements.
The Northwest Indiana Symphony Chorus is singing again after, sorry, I'm loud. I'm mic'd. Is singing again after 2 years. Dick and I happened to sing with them. We're one of 75, but it is such a treasure to Northwest Indiana. The concert today is Annalise, which is the Anne Frank story. It is gorgeous. There's an exquisite soloist from St. Mary's. It's at 3 p.m. at St. Thomas More, 3 p.m. at St. Thomas More. And just, if you get a chance, it is an amazing, gorgeous concert. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Pete.
Yes, good morning. This afternoon there is a cleanup of Briar East Woods, which is right over here in Tesla.
Can you use the mic so the people online can hear you?
This one? Good morning. This afternoon from 1 to 4, and you can come whenever and leave whenever. There's a cleanup of Briar East Woods, which is right over here in Hessville. It's run by a great group, community group called Hessville Dunes Busters. It's at 169th and Parish. You park right by the big water tower, and just help the community clean up one of the very last remnants of the Tollstone Dunes. It's just a few miles away. I have maps if anybody would like to join us in that little cleanup.
Thank
What
you,
a great
Pete. Thank
thing.
you, Maggie.
Oh.
Good morning, and welcome to the worship service of the First Unitarian Church of Hobart, Indiana. My name is Sandi. My pronouns are her and she. I participate in the life of the church by serving as president of the board, and I do a few other things besides. We are a religious community of diverse beliefs and shared values. Our diverse beliefs are expressed in our 6 sources, and our shared values are expressed in our 7 principles, both of which can be found at uua.org or on the inside of your hymnals. Together we strive to grow spiritually, build community, and live our values in the world. We are pleased to announce that Reverend Tom Bozeman has been called to be our full-time minister starting August 1st. Until then, and when we do not have a minister in the pulpit, we invite members or guests to share a special message with us, and today I'm it.
Yay!
The service will be recorded and will be available for future viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and the church website. Let your Facebook and Twitter friends know that you are attending worship with #FirstUnitarianHobart. Now, please silence your devices, take a deep breath, and then another deep breath, and join us in a spirit of reverence.
gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. Light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, celebration of the life we share together.
The opening words are from a collection of children's drawings and poems from Theresian concentration camp, 1942 to 1944. The title of the poem is The Butterfly by Pavel Friedman, April 6th, 1942. The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow, perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against a white stone. Such a yellow is carried lightly, way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks I've lived in here, penned up inside this ghetto. But I have found what I love here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut branches in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto. The poem is preserved in typewritten copy on thin copy paper in the collection of poetry by Pavel Friedman, which was donated to the State Jewish Museum during its documentation campaign. Pavel Friedman was born on January 7, 1921 in Prague and deported to Terezin on April 26, 1942. He died in Auschwitz on September 29, 1944. Please rise as you are able and join in singing the opening hymn, number 219, O Hear My People. Please be seated. And join in the affirmation of faith. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. Service is its prayer. And this is our covenant. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And I'm sorry, I should have left you standing, because now you have to stand to greet your neighbor.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Hi, darling. I don't want some touch in here. Good morning. From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung through every land by every tongue. Amen. Ha.
This congregation expresses our greatest joys and deepest sorrows in community. We believe that a joy shared is magnified and a sorrow that is shared is diminished. We pause, listening to what arises from within our hearts. We will not pass the microphone, so please speak loudly. If you cannot hear, please raise your hand and I will paraphrase. Are there any joys or sorrows to be shared today? Yes. allegiance. The title of the book is Terrible Things, an Allegory of the Holocaust by Eve Bunting. The clearing in the woods was home to the small forest creatures. The birds and squirrels shared the trees. The rabbits and porcupines shared the shade beneath the trees, and the frogs and fish shared the cool brown waters of the forest pool. They were content until the day the terrible things came. Little Rabbit saw their terrible shadows before he saw them. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, and their shadows blotted out the sun. We have come for every creature with feathers on its back, the terrible things thundered. We don't have feathers, the frogs said. Oh, nor we, said the squirrels. Oh, nor we, said the porcupines. Nor we, said the rabbits. The little fish leaped from the water to show the shine of their scales, but the birds twittered nervously in the tops of the trees. Feathers! They rose in the air, then screamed away into the blue of the sky. But the terrible things had brought their terrible nets, and they flung them high and caught the birds and carried them away. The other forest creatures talked nervously among themselves. Those birds were always too noisy, old Porcupine said. Good riddance, I say. There's more room in the trees now, said the squirrels. Why did the terrible things want the birds? Little Rabbit asked. What's wrong with feathers? We mustn't ask, Big Rabbit said. The terrible things don't need a reason. Just be glad it wasn't us they wanted. Now there were no birds to sing in the clearing, but life went on as before, until the day the terrible things came back. Little Bird heard the thump of their terrible feet before they came into sight. We have come for every bushy-tailed creature who lives in the clearing, the terrible things thundered. Oh, we have no tails, the frog said. Nor do we, not real tails, the porcupine said. The little fish leaped from the water to show the smooth shine of their finned tails, and the rabbits turned their rumps so the terrible things could see for themselves. Our tails are round and furry, they said. By no means are they bushy. The squirrels chittered their fear and ran high into the treetops. But the terrible things swung their terrible nets higher than the squirrels could run, and wider than the squirrels could leap, and caught them all and carried them away. Those squirrels were greedy, Big Rabbit said, always storing away things for themselves, never sharing. But why did the terrible things take them away? Little Rabbit asked. Do the terrible things want the clearing for themselves? No, they have their own place, Big Rabbit said. But the terrible things don't need a reason. Just mind your own business, Little Rabbit. We don't want them to get mad at us. Now there were no birds to sing or squirrels to chitter in the trees, but life in the clearing went on almost as before, until the day the terrible things came again. Little Rabbit heard the rumble of their terrible voices. We have come for every creature that swims, the terrible things thundered. Oh, we can't swim, the rabbits said quickly. And we can't swim, the porcupines said. The frogs dived deeper into the forest pool, and ripples spiraled like corkscrews on the dark brown water. The little fish darted this way and that in streaks of silver, but the terrible things threw their terrible nets down into the depths, and they dragged up the dripping frogs and the shimmering fish and carried them away. Why did the terrible things take them? Little Rabbit asked. What did the frogs and fish do to them? Oh, probably nothing, Big Rabbit said, but the terrible things don't need a reason. Many creatures dislike frogs, lumpy, slimy things, and fish are so cold and unfriendly they never talk to any of us. Now there were no birds to sing, no squirrels to chitter, no frogs to croak, no fish to play in the forest pool. A nervous silence filled the clearing, but life went on almost as usual until the day the terrible things came back. Little Rabbit smelled their terrible smell before they came into sight. The rabbits and the porcupines looked everywhere except at each other. We have come for every creature that sprouts quills, the terrible things thundered. The rabbits stopped quivering. We don't have quills, they said, fluffing their soft white fur. The porcupines bristled with all their strength. But the terrible things covered them with the curl of their terrible nets, and the porcupines hung in them like flies in a spider's web as the terrible things carried them away. Oh, those porcupines always were bad-tempered, Big Rabbit said shakily. Prickly, sticky things. This time, Little Rabbit didn't ask why. By now he knew that the terrible things didn't need a reason. The smell still filled the clearing, though the terrible things had gone. I liked it better when there were all kinds of creatures in our clearing, he said. I think we should move. What if the terrible things come back? Nonsense, Big Rabbit said. Why should we move? This has always been our home, and the terrible things won't come back. We're the white rabbits. It couldn't happen to us. As day followed peaceful day, Little Rabbit thought Big Rabbit must be right, until the day the terrible things came back. Little Rabbit saw the terrible gleam of their terrible eyes through the forest darkness, and he smelled again the terrible smell. We have come for any creature that is white, the terrible things thundered. There are no white creatures here but us, Big Rabbit said. We have come for you, the terrible things said. The rabbits scampered in every direction. Help, they screamed. Somebody help. But there was no one left to help. And the big circling nets dropped over them, and the terrible things carried them away. All but Little Rabbit, who was little enough to hide in a pile of rocks by the pond and smart enough to stay so still that the terrible things thought he was a rock himself. When they had all gone, Little Rabbit crept into the middle of the empty clearing. I should have tried to help the other rabbits, he thought. If only we creatures had stuck together, it could have been different. Sadly, Little Rabbit left the clearing. He'd go tell other forest creatures about the terrible things. He hoped someone would listen. I've read this poem before for a service, but it seemed particularly appropriate to start this out. It's a poem by the Nobel Prize-winning laureate, Polish poet Wisława Szymborska. Hatred is the title of the poem. See how efficient it still is, how it keeps itself in shape, our century's hatred. How easily it vaults the tallest obstacles, how rapidly it pounces, tracks us down. It's not like other feelings, at once both older and younger. It gives birth itself to the reasons that give it life. When it sleeps, it's never eternal rest. And sleeplessness won't sap its strength, it feeds it. One religion or another, whatever gets it ready, in position. One fatherland or another, whatever helps it get a running start. Justice always works well at the outset until hate gets its own momentum going. Hatred, hatred. Its face twisted in a grimace of erotic ecstasy. Oh, these other feelings, listless weaklings. Since when does brotherhood draw crowds? Has compassion ever finished first? Does doubt ever really rouse the rabble? Only hatred has just what it takes. Gifted, diligent, hardworking. Need we mention all the songs it has composed, all the pages it has added to our history books, all the human carpets it has spread over countless city squares and football fields? Let's face it, it knows how to make beauty. The splendid fire glow in midnight skies, magnificent bursting bombs and rosy dawns. You can't deny the inspiring pathos of ruins and a certain bawdy humor to be found in the sturdy column jutting from their midst. Hatred is a master of contrast between explosions and dead quiet, red blood and white snow. Above all, it never tires of its leitmotif, the impeccable executioner towering over its soiled victim. It's always ready for new challenges. If it has to wait a while, it will. They say it's blind. Blind. It has a sniper's keen sight and gazes unflinchingly at the future as only it can. This coming Wednesday and Thursday, April 27th and 28th, is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, one of the most solemn occasions in the Jewish faith. The very first Holocaust Remembrance Day occurred in Israel in December 27th and 28th of 1949. After some deliberation, the Israeli government moved the date of commemoration to the 27th of Nisan, which falls in our April or May, and the first officially recognized Yom HaShoah occurred on May 2nd and 3rd in 1951. Not to be confused with International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which takes place on January 27th every year. Yom HaShoah. Yom, day. Shoah, whirlwind, Holocaust, catastrophe. If you are in Israel on the day of Yom HaShoah at 10 in the morning, you will hear air raid sirens blasting into the air. And if you are an observant Jew, you must stop whatever you are doing and pause for 2 minutes of silent reflection and remembrance of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. At sundown the evening before, you would have been able to watch or attend a state ceremony at Yad Vashem, during which the flag was lowered to half-mast and prayers were uttered and 6 torches were lit, one for each of 1 million murdered Jews. It's not a day of celebration. It's a solemn, serious day of remembrance, of prayer, of mourning, of recognition of lives lost to hate. I lived the first 7 years of my life in Chicago, in a Polish Catholic neighborhood near Humboldt Park. My grandmother, who owned the gravestone in which my family lived, took care of me while my parents worked. She took me and my younger brother with her on the bus to shop for bargains and comestibles in Maxwell Street and Randolph Street. It was there that I saw something that puzzled me. A woman selling vegetables with numbers written on her arm. And not too far from her, a man who sharpened knives and scissors, who also had a number on his arm. I waited until we were in the bus to ask my grandmother what the numbers were. She never really answered me in a way I found believable, and when we went back, I sought out those 2 vendors so I could stare at their forearms and carefully checked every vendor I saw for those mysterious numbers. I forgot about them for some time, years in fact. We moved out of the city to a small town and then the country, and my grandparents bought a chicken farm. It wasn't until 6 or 7 years later that I recalled the tattoos. For one of my birthdays, my father, always vigilant in preparing me for disappointment in the world, bought me the diary of a young girl, and I read it with an intensity that he may have found frightening. It opened up a whole new avenue of inquiry for me. I became an insatiable reader of books on the Holocaust, on slavery and civil rights, and later on the history of our treatment of indigenous people and the patriarchy. For more than a few years, I was not a pleasant person to be around. When I was 12, not long after reading Anne Frank's diary, I told my parents I was done with church. My father had been dropping my brother and me off at CCD and Mass for quite a while. My brother never thanked me for this, because without me to watch over him, he wouldn't have to go. By the time I was 17, I was ready to study Judaism. There was no synagogue in my town, but someone I babysat for introduced me to her rabbi, and I began taking lessons. I was pretty serious, and although I never formally converted, I gained an enormous respect for Judaism, and especially for the emphasis on social justice exemplified by my teacher, Rabbi Lowenstein. And I found the high holidays moving and life-affirming, much more so than anything I had ever experienced at Christmas or Easter. Spurred by my first experience of a Yom HaShoah commemoration at KAM Israel in Chicago, I made a vow that if I was ever lucky enough to travel to Europe, I would make it my mission to make a pilgrimage to Dachau and Auschwitz, Theresienstadt, and you can understand I was not a fun person to be around. And then my chance came. My boyfriend at the time and I backpacked in Europe for 4 months. And yes, we did some of the normal tourist things, but a highlight of the trip for me was supposed to be stopping at Dachau. But it wasn't a highlight. It was sterile and museum-like, in no way resembling anything I had read about. I knew from my reading that it hadn't been one of the worst of the camps. How revolting to think that we can rank the horrors. But I expected to be moved to tears or rage or disgust with the human species in ways that I had been by Elie Wiesel's Night, or Nellie Sachs's poems, or Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, or Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, or yes, Anne Frank's diary. I had hoped that visiting the ruins of a camp and the attendant memorials, some of them quite beautiful and moving, would help me understand why this had happened. It wasn't until years later that I felt what I thought I was looking for on that day in 1973 at Dachau. 20 years later, I flew to Florence to meet my daughter, who was in a summer study program at NYU's Florence site. We planned to take 2 weeks in the Czech Republic and Poland. The Czech Republic to visit Prague, the home of one of my favorite writers, Franz Kafka, of course. And Poland to visit Krakow and Warsaw. And yes, I thought, Auschwitz, also known as Auschwitz. I had read a wonderful book by Bernie Glassman of the Zen Peacemaker Order, Bearing Witness, a Zen master's lessons in making peace. In it, he describes some of the work that the Zen Peacemaker Order does in the prisons and on the streets, with the homeless, with AIDS patients. But the opening chapters tell of the pilgrimage he made with 150 other people in Thanksgiving week in 1996 to the town of Auschwitz in Poland. He wrote, quote, I was determined to bring people from different religions and nationalities to the very place where diversity had once been condemned to a terrible grave. There we would bear witness to our differences. Out of that, a healing would arise. The beauty and incredible difficulty of this retreat and pilgrimage, which in reality was 150 retreats and pilgrimages, took place over 5 emotionally exhausting and challenging days. And yet, as Glassman acknowledged, for the diverse group of people in attendance, survivors of the Holocaust, children of survivors, children of Nazis, children of German soldiers, children of refugees, and people with no direct family connection to Auschwitz whatsoever. Auschwitz, for all its horrors, he said, had a healing energy. Glassman's book and the retreat he describes was not the only thing in my mind when I planned our trip to Poland. I had also been watching reruns of The Twilight Zone, one of my favorite television shows and one which we watched as a family when I was growing up. One episode, originally broadcast in 1959, written by that great menacer of the public's conscience, Rod Serling, had impressed me deeply. Death's Head Revisited, in which former SS Captain Gunther Lutze pays a visit to the ruins of Dachau to remember the good old days. And I'm sure that there are some in the audience old enough to remember this episode. As he walks around the camp, reminiscing, he meets up with Alfred Becker, one of the former inmates he had tormented and murdered. Many of you may remember this particularly harrowing episode, but for the youngsters that are here, let's just say that things do not go well for Herr Lutze, as Alfred Becker, who was executed by him, and a dozen of his other victims put him on trial. It indeed does not end well for him, and he is found later by people ranting and raving after having been tried and convicted by the ghosts of the victims. He is sedated by a doctor and carted off to a mental institution. And the doctor asks about Dachau, why does it still stand? Why do we keep it standing? And of course, we keep it standing because our task as humans is to repair or mend the world. Tikkun olam, it is called in Hebrew. And in order to perform tikkun olam, we must zakor, remember. So we have preserved as much as possible the remains of the concentration and extermination camps and erected memorials to the people who were murdered there. Unfortunately, in this country, we have been shamefully slow to acknowledge, atone for, and even teach our children about the horrors visited on the indigenous peoples whose land we commandeered and the people of color we enslaved and oppressed and lynched. It is thanks to Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevenson is the author of Just Mercy, which I know some of you have read. It's thanks to him that we finally have in Montgomery, Alabama, no less, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which commemorates those Black victims of lynching. And much as the doctor in the Twilight Zone episode Death's Head revisited, many people have asked, why? Why not let sleeping dogs lie? Zakor, that's why. Remembrance. We cannot heal from what we do not acknowledge. We cannot heal from what we do not confront. We cannot heal with lies or distortions or denials. Our children need to know their history. Yes, it will be painful. And yes, it will not be easy. And yes, it is something we owe them, the truth. So my daughter and I went to Krakow, but I didn't get to Auschwitz. My daughter was very uncomfortable about going, and she worried about me going alone. So I contented myself with walking through Kazimierz, the former Jewish ghetto, and we moved on to Warsaw. And it was there that I learned that I didn't need to visit the ruins of a concentration or death camp to be reminded of the horror of the Holocaust and to know why it was important to never forget, to always zakor, remember. To always remember any injustice, any oppression, as if it were tattooed on my brain. In all the reading I had done over the years, the horrors of the Holocaust and slavery and the genocide of indigenous people were emblazoned in my memory and my conscience. But the stories that stood out the most to me were the stories of the people who had given their lives or otherwise brought about their ruin by acts of kindness and compassion in the face of cruelty. Stories like the one the Australian novelist Thomas Keneally told in Schindler's Ark, and which Steven Spielberg retold in Schindler's List. But no story moved me as much as that of Janusz Korczak, the Polish Jewish educator, pediatrician, and writer who worked as the principal of an orphanage that still stands today in Warsaw at 6 Jaktorowska Street. When the Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940, the children were moved from the orphanage and Korczak moved with them. In August of 1942, a year before the ghetto was destroyed by the Nazis, they came to get the nearly 200 orphans to be transported to Treblinka, an extermination camp. Korczak had been offered sanctuary with the Polish underground, but he would not let the children go alone to what was certain death. I wish I had a picture to show you. I couldn't find my photo. In Warsaw today, next to the Jewish cemetery is a powerful statue memorializing Janusz Korczak on his final day in the Warsaw Ghetto in the early days of August 1942. It shows him striding forward with a child, arms wrapped around his neck in one arm, and trailing close behind 5 children, holding hands. And one of those children has Korczak's hand. It is a simple but moving piece of art, a memorial to a man whose love of children knew no bounds, not even that of certain death. So, we have a lot to remember. Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, the Trail of Tears, Emmett Till, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, Wilmington, Tulsa, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Japanese internment camps, My Lai, etc., etc., etc. And in this time of rising anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, misogyny, and other xenophobias and oppressions, we need to remember where these have taken us before. We must never forget, and we must take every opportunity to tell our children and grandchildren. They cannot correct or erase from the annals of history the terrible things done by us or those who came before us. But learning the truth of our failures as well as our successes can help them be more vigilant and protective of basic human rights and responsibilities. I know I'm speaking to the choir here. I know that the people sitting in these pews here today are awake, aware, woke, however you care to phrase it. But I also know, pardon my hubris, that you are the ones who will teach the children and the grandchildren about the terrible things and fight to stop them from happening again. And I thank Providence, or whatever it was that brought me through those doors 33 years ago. But perhaps the words that Rod Serling used at the end of that Twilight Zone episode of 63 years ago might serve well here. Quote, all the Dachau's must remain standing. The Dachau's, the Belsens, the Buchenwalds, the Auschwitzes, all of them. They must remain standing because they are a monument to a moment in time when some men decided to turn the earth into a graveyard. Into it, they shoveled all of their reason, their logic, their knowledge, but worst of all, their conscience. And the moment we forget this, the moment we cease to be haunted by its remembrance, then we become the gravediggers, something to dwell on and to remember, not only in the Twilight Zone, but wherever men walk the earth. Thank you. Amen. Now is the time in our service for our offering. We give to remind ourselves how many gifts we have to offer. We give to remember that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. We give because we believe in music and sacred space. We give with the faith that together we have enough. We have 2 offerings. The basket is for the general operating expenses of the church. The cup offering goes to who this month? Wild Ones? Okay.
Which promotes native plant community group.
I don't know where the other cup is.
Oh, we only have one somewhere. For your prayers, your presence, your service, and your gifts, we are truly grateful.
Do you want me to introduce this? It's weird.
Please join in singing the closing hymn, number 1037, in your teal hymnal.
Do you want me to explain it?
Maggie will be singing, will guide you in the singing of the response. I will be reading the words that ask you to respond.
Thank you. Can we go through the response once together?
Yes.
So we're all clear. Please rise as you are able. Ourselves and each other, we begin again in love. Let's sing it together. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Great, we're ready.
For each time that our fears have made us rigid and
Wait.
inaccessible.
Oh, did you already read that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
Thank you,
you.
Maggie.
You may be seated.
The closing words are the opening paragraph of the introduction to Michiko Kakutani's book, The Death of Truth. Two of the most monstrous regimes in human history came to power in the 20th century, and both were predicated upon the violation and despoiling of truth, upon the knowledge that cynicism and weariness and fear can make people susceptible to the lies and false promises of leaders bent on unconditional power. As Hannah Arendt wrote in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. standards of thought, no longer exist."
Extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. Carry in our hearts till we are together again.
Before the concert.
You do?
Well, I got to run.
Yeah, I might go visit my dad.
Thank you.